My name is Michael Saraceno. I'm a citizen. While greenhouse gas emissions from aviation may be only 2 to 2.5%, the global aviation CO2 emission almost equals the amount of CO2 put out by the country of Germany. Others have talked about how CO2 is trapped in the atmosphere and causes warming of the earth, so I will leave more of that to them. But the fact is that the more CO2 that is put into the atmosphere, that results in more combustion. And I think one of the biggest concerns with more combustion from aviation and the sure increase in aviation, the FAA forecasts that aviation will grow 2% per year, reaching 1 billion passengers by 2029. And the issue with more combustion not only is more CO2, but the FAA Modernization Act that was recently passed in 2012 essentially is allowing the FAA through precision-based navigation to save. Yes, they do save fuel on descent because they're not doing step down. But what they're not telling you is the FAA is allowing the airlines to crop dust USA, okay? And the reason how they're doing this is through next gen or precision-based navigation. They're allowing the airlines to pack in more planes in tidal formation at much lower altitudes. And we know from NASA that aircraft operations below 3,000 feet decrease ground level air quality. Okay, and that's NASA saying that, and I'm submitting my testimony into the docket as well with all the references, so you can feel free to look them up yourself. So we have all around this country the FAA allowing, right, they changed the highways in the sky across USA, and they have not found one environmental impact. That's it. You can change the highway over the entire continental U.S., and there's not one environmental impact that will impose on anyone or any person. That is absolutely ridiculous. But the most important issue, the reason why this needs to be investigated further, is that the more combustion that we have, the more landings and takeoffs year over year impacts the people who live downwind from airports across the United States. Now, what's the difference, right, from living downwind from a highway, from living downwind to the airport? Because certainly, both of those situations will give you downwind pollution. And the difference is that highways have noise barriers or pollution barriers, and NOAA has done studies on this, that those sound barriers with vegetation prevent highway pollution from floating downwind into communities, okay? Where is the barriers to downwind pollution from aviation? And most of that is through approaches. I've listed several studies that have done London Heathrow, LaGuardia, a bunch of different studies that have shown that, in fact, airport particulates can reach as far as 5 to 6, in some cases 10 nautical miles downwind from an airport. Okay? And so the biggest issue with that is that we know that vaccines do not cause autism. Okay? The largest organization in February 2012 came out and said that vaccines do not cause autism. And why did they say that? Because every scientific journal that was published on that refuted that. And in fact, it proved the opposite of that. We now have 12 peer-reviewed studies, and I've cited in my references, that there's an increased risk of autism associated with increased air pollution around conception and or pregnancy. The vast majority, and I talked to Harvard scientists through personal communication, is not genetic. It's environmentally induced pollution. And the environmentally induced pollution is what is causing autism. And we will see a spike in autism across the USA, and I don't care, they can change the diagnosis or hide the incidence. But the fact of the matter is more children are receiving services today than they were, and they will continue to receive more services over the next 10 years. There is a heavy metal load in autism. We know that. That's why vaccines were pointed at. The heavy metal load in in air pollution can in fact deposit in the hair and nails of these children. And in fact, when they do look back at the hair and nails of these children, they find that the heavy metal deposition in the hair and nails is significantly higher than typically developing children. So we know they're being exposed to toxic metals, and that's from environmental pollution. UC Davis 2012 just came out with a new study that said the 2015 cost of autism-related expenses are $268 billion, and by the year 2025, it could be anywhere between $500 to $1 trillion in related costs. We know that aviation emissions have trace heavy metals. They have the byproduct is NOx. It is sulfur. The aviation jet fuel contains 100 times more sulfur than diesel trucks. And we can talk about autism, but also high air pollution areas also decrease IQ of children. And the very interesting thing about that is that even when these children hit 6, 7 years old, they still did not catch up to their peers. So this damage that's being caused by low IQ, by pollution-induced, and it does have effect on one of the most important things that I will tell you. If you want to know how dangerous air pollution is, you just have to look at the transgenerational epigenetic changes. So there was a study done in that I have in the reference by, let's see here, where is it, by Tracy in 2013. And so what they did is they exposed mice to jet fuel, and what they found is that it didn't change the gene, but it changed the way the gene was expressed. And that change in the way the gene is expressed for obesity got into the genome and was passed on to subsequent generations. Okay, and so this is why I care, because my nieces and nephews, my children, could potentially marry somebody else's kids who are in a heavily polluted environment, and that change in the genome gets into the gene pool. So your grandchildren and great-grandchildren could in fact develop transgenerational epigenetic changes through environmental pollution. And another way, besides greenhouse gases, and I'll keep this brief, there is evidence to show that persistent contrails do in fact warm the Earth. They trap incoming solar radiation and they block outgoing infrared radiation. And so there were studies done by NASA, and what they found is after the 9/11 attacks, there was a 1 degree Celsius spike between the maximum highs and the maximum lows in terms of temperature. So they looked at skies without contrails after 9/11 because the planes were grounded for 3 days, and they found a spike in the temperature range. So in fact, contrails do change the climate. And I'll just end with another NASA scientist also talked about contrails, and he's using data from, I think, the 1990s to 2000s, early 2000s. So this is old data, but what he says is that increase in surface and lower atmosphere's temperatures by 0.36 or 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. So that's what he's saying the contribution to contrails could be to warming. 0.36 to 0.54% Fahrenheit per decade. And I think that proves that contrails do in fact affect temperature. And the other thing you should know about persistent contrails, is we have more combustion, more jet aircraft, more airplanes, you're going to get more contrails, and you're going to get more warming. So it's this whole vicious cycle. And the thing about contrails is that they produce clouds that morph into cirrus. Okay? When they study contrail spreading, they only study within the first few hours. They do not study the whole life of that artificial cloud that's produced. And that artificial cloud that is produced would not have formed if there would not have been a contrail in that area. So these clouds that are being induced are producing clouds that would not naturally be there. That changes the hydrological cycle, which is rain. And the other thing that you should know is that the way it could change the rain is that when the engine at high altitude freezes the ice crystals in the atmosphere, it is actually changing the vapor content in the atmosphere. Okay, so that vapor content will have a change on regional climate change. And I thank you very much for having this open hearing.